Thank you, Dr. Rusk. Thank you all. It's good to be with you this afternoon, and appreciate everybody being here. I kind of wanted to appreciated Don's comment a minute ago about why he's here. He's here. He said he was here because Kenny told him to be here, and I'm here because Dave Lawman told me to be here. So I'm kind of in the same situation. But, and you probably could see a little bit of a theme in some of the things we're talking about. I think when Dave came several months ago and asked me to talk about this and explore this concept, I thought it was really interesting and could be valuable. And so I think we'll kind of talk about some of these concepts. I don't have just a tremendous amount of data to show you, but I think hopefully there's some concepts here that you may have thought about in different ways and that you may be able to think about these semi-confinement systems from maybe a slightly different perspective than what's been talked about before. But so I want to talk about coming at this question from the perspective of doing a better job of managing grazing lands, doing a better job of managing ranches, and how, if we have the option of semi-confinement, how can we do that? And so we'll come at it from that perspective. So just to introduce, I want to talk just a second about sustainability, ranch sustainability. This is a definition that's a little bit small in this room, I think. This is a definition that has been floated around about sustainable development for a long time. It says, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I think that's an interesting definition. And it's really similar to what I hear ranchers talk about their main goal is for their ranch, which is always, I want to pass this down to the next generation. And so we're talking about the same thing in those concepts. I think that's an important piece to think about. This is a little graphic that helps me think about some of these concepts and fitting things together from a truly sustainable standpoint. And you know, it's important to remember, we've talked a lot about the economic piece of sustainability. There's also an environmental piece and a social piece. And when you have all that, can achieve all of those together, that's where you get sustainability. And so we're going to talk about some of the economics like we have before, and a little bit about the environment, and maybe touch on a piece of the social aspect of this as well. And in the title, I use the term ecosystem services. And that may be a new term to some of you. It was kind of a new term to me not very long ago. But they're important and a useful concept. Ecosystem services are basically the benefits that ecosystems can provide to humans, to people, to society. They can be direct benefits or indirect benefits, and they can be, I'm going to move that a little bit. They can be either large or small benefits. And so what are we talking about? This graphic, I think, helps think about that a little bit, and these many of these are in the proceedings if you want to look there. But these are all several different kinds of ecosystem services that grazing lands as an ecosystem could provide to society. They can be grouped into supporting functions, which you can see things like biodiversity, photosynthesis, soil formation. They have provisioning services, which could be things like providing food, clean water, wood products, those things like that to society. These ecosystems also provide regulating services, so they can control flooding, they can purify water, purify air, those kind of things. And then they can also have cultural services, providing aesthetic value or recreation and habitat and those kind of issues. And so those are all ecosystem services that these grazing lands that we manage can provide. And I think, maybe we'll talk right here just a minute. I think sometimes it's hard to define what good range management is or what good grazing management is. And maybe a useful way to think about it in some contexts is that a really optimum balance, a good balance of ecosystem services is a good working definition of good grazing management. So we want to be able to manage these ecosystems to provide a good balance of all of those different kinds of ecosystem services. This concept applies really widely. If you look at the total amount of land area in the continental United States, the biggest percentage of land area is rangeland, and obviously That's a lot of that is under the control of ranchers that are running beef cows on it. And so a huge part of the area of the United States, this kind of a discussion, this kind of a thought process would be applicable to. Also, there's also a lot of pasture land and forest land that these concepts would apply to as well. So if we think about, now to kind of get into, with that background, think about a little bit of how we would do a better job, at least from my perspective in thinking about Oklahoma native range managers. How would we do a better job managing native range? And think, well, what does native range in Oklahoma need? Well, I can kind of think of three things. One would be what native range needs is protection from overgrazing, especially could be during what I think of critical times, and we've talked about this before, it's been brought up before, things like drought, potentially the late summer growing season is a critical time for native range when it needs to be protected from too intense defoliation in the late summer growing season so that it can replenish root reserves and maintain vigor. So that would be one thing native range would need, be protection from overgrazing. Another thing that native range might need would be rest. And this would be planned, I think of planned late season rest as being a little bit different from overgrazing because this is an effort of planning and consistently allowing late season rest even in times that aren't a critical emergency time, even if it's not a drought, for instance. And so I think those are similar concepts, but maybe there's a little distinction there between protection from overgrazing and planned rest. And then the third thing is prescribed fire. And native range in Oklahoma evolved under periodic burning. And we've seen, if you remove that from the system, we've seen the damage that does to the ecosystem and the damage potentially that does to beef cattle production from these systems. And so when I was thinking about this, I kind of came up with these three areas of this is what native range needs in Oklahoma for us to do a good job managing it. We need to provide these things, okay? I noticed this too at this summer's meeting of the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association. This was in their proceedings and was a list of all the resolutions that they passed at their meeting. And I saw this one. I don't know if it's been in there before or not, but I thought it was interesting. One of the resolutions that the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association passed was a resolution on rangeland improvement, and it says, resolved, the OCA urges members to develop for his or her own ranch a grazing plan that includes at least proper stocking and, when possible, a period of rest during the growing season for each pasture unit. And that kind of reinforced to me that some of these concepts are important for cattle producers in Oklahoma to pay attention to. So I liked being able to point that out. So if we're going to provide those three things to native range, the protection from overgrazing, planned rest, and prescribed fire, what tools do we need to have to be able to do that? So if we're going to protect our native range from overgrazing, especially in a emergency situation, what do we need? Well, we need the discipline to remove livestock from the system, to remove them from the pasture, take away the grazing pressure, and when we do that, we need a place to put those cattle, obviously. So if we're going to provide rest, planned rest, what do we need to do that? Even when it's not an emergency, we need to be planning for it. We need to have a management plan in place to be able to rest those pastures. And again, we need a place to put the cattle so that when we remove the grazing pressure from the pasture. And for prescribed fire, we obviously need safe environmental conditions in which to burn, and we need accumulated fuel in the pasture to carry a burn. And then, and obviously, to accumulate fuel, we have to remove cattle from the system to let that accumulate. And we have to have a place for our cattle to go when that pasture is recovering from the burn and regrowing. So the common theme, as I was thinking about it through all this, is what we really need is a place to put cattle to be able to do a better job managing range in Oklahoma. That's what we really need is a place to put our cattle. And there's really three options for doing that in Oklahoma. One is, or for providing all those things, one option would be for producers to have a kind of an elaborate grazing plan, an elaborate grazing system that you could work potentially and provide some of the rest in different areas. One option would be to load cattle onto a truck when the time came to rest those pastures, to ship the cattle and get rid of them, cull them, sell them. And that, I think that's been our management recommendation for a long time, especially in response to a drought, has been when you get into a drought system, you need to cull cattle and just load them on a truck and sell them. That's been the solution. And that is one solution. But I think another solution would be to have a feedlot as a place for those cattle to go, and be able to implement a semi-confined management system and provide an option for an elaborate grazing plan that a lot of people probably can't implement very well, or the option of selling cattle and just culling them. And so that, I think, kind of justifies to me why a semi-confinement might be a really good option to help manage grazing lands. So if we were thinking about what the goals would be for a production system like this, a goal would be to improve the management of native range. To do that, again, we would need to provide rest and periodic fire and provide relief from seasonal flash droughts. Another goal would be to maintain or improve beef production, and I think that is the goal right there that just culling cattle, putting them on a truck and selling them doesn't address. That does not maintain beef production, and a semi-confinement system would maintain or improve beef production. We could avoid culling those profitable, productive cows. We could increase the pounds of beef produced from the ranch. And then potentially another goal would be to decrease cost, or as Rick pointed out a minute ago, at least decrease the unit cost of production in these systems. And I think that might be a challenge when thinking about a semi-confinement system, is how do we implement it and reduce cost at the same time? And potentially one way to do that would be to improve production enough that you actually can decrease the unit cost of production if you can't just totally decrease the total dollars out of pocket. So, and another goal here, I think, would be, and this may be hard to see down here at the bottom, but would be to maintain animal welfare and social acceptance of our beef production practices. And while I don't think we have really any issues to worry about there for the most part in extensive rangeland type production, beef production, we may get into some of those in some kind of confined systems. And so I think it's at least important to consider and put in the decision matrix. So let's think about an example, if you will, of how this concept could be applied, at least in theory. And this is maybe a little bit of a contrived example, but I think it illustrates the point. This donut chart, if you can see that, kind of describes the production system that I'm going to call a traditional spring calving system in Oklahoma. And I think this may not be any one specific ranch, but I think it kind of represents a lot of what I see looking at producers' ranch operations in Oklahoma. The outer ring of the donut is the grazing system, is kind of the grazing plan. The inner ring is the cattle production plan, and then it goes around the year starting up here in January. And so you can see in this system, this red piece is when cows are calving, and in this traditional system we've got cows calving for 90 days starting in middle of February, and then we've got a lactation period of these cows in the blue part of the ring here until sometime in mid-September when we might wean those calves, and then we've got dry cows in this gray piece for a little less than half the year. And that's kind of might be pretty typical production system, traditional production system in Oklahoma. And this would kind of be a typical grazing system in Oklahoma. We've got these cows out on native range, out on native pasture all year round. And basically, when it kind of starts greening up a little bit in March, we're going to say those cows are grazing, and they're going to graze all spring, all summer, all fall, up into the winter, and then at some point between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we're going to decide, well, we're out of pasture, we've used it all up, and we're going to start feeding hay. And we just feed hay, just feed round bales of hay on the pasture. And that's what a lot of producers do. And so I think, you know, we've got at least a 70 or 80 day, something like that, period of full feeding hay on the pasture. And so that is kind of a typical production system. So a couple of notes here with this system that I used. The breeding period in this kind of a production system would be from May the 8th to August the 6th. Would just kind of for reference would be when the breeding season would be. And then I made lots of assumptions, which I think are hard to make, some of these assumptions, because every ranch is so different and every year is so different. But I tried to estimate the nutrition cost in this system using just kind of an apples to apples comparison would be about $280 per year. And that obviously that would change based on market prices from year to year and what you decided to include and what you didn't include. But really what I was interested most in is how does the nutrition cost change from this system to an alternative. And so that kind of gives us a baseline. Whether that's right or wrong or not doesn't matter, but how that changes I think is what is important. So we were at $280 there. So that's kind of the traditional system. I don't know if anybody would argue with that as being a traditional system, but that's kind of the base of where I started. And this would kind of be certainly a contrived example of the traditional grazing plan. I assumed, just made up a ranch that had 3 pastures, and this is kind of what the grazing plan would look like for that ranch. All 3 pastures are going to be grazed from early in the spring, say March or April, all the way through until December, and then I wasn't sure what to call this period down here where we're feeding hay. I guess you could call it that we're resting those pastures. We're certainly feeding hay on those pastures, but I'm not really sure we're resting them because the cows are out there on them. We don't have too much forage growing at that point, but whatever green forage would grow from any cool seasons in that pasture, the cows are going to consume. So I'm not really sure that we could call this saying the pastures are rested, but I did in this figure. And I think one point to think about is even if this is the rest period for this pasture, it's at the wrong time of the year to achieve the goals we talked about before. We need to give these pastures rest in the late growing season, and this is in the wintertime in the dormant season. So that's kind of the traditional where I started. So we could think about how would we change this to something of a theoretical alternative system. And if we were coming at it from the perspective of improving management of native range, and we could use confinement, what would an example of that system look like? And I kind of picked this one, and I probably cheated a little bit and improved a couple of other management things too while I was going along. So I shortened the calving season a little bit here in this one. So we've got a shorter calving season, and I also moved the calving season so that it's later in the spring. Okay, and I actually shortened the lactation period and used early weaning in this production system, and I think that's okay because I'm assuming that we aren't going to sell these calves at weaning. We shouldn't sell calves at weaning just because we weaned them. We should sell calves when we want to sell them because that's when it's profitable to sell them. And so in this system, we would wean these calves here kind of in late fall, but we would I would expect most producers that would think about this would want to retain ownership of those calves through a stocker, backgrounder, face, whatever. So really the difference in cash flow from the weaning weight shouldn't really be real because we wouldn't sell these calves at this point. But you can see we've shortened our calving season, we've shortened our lactation season or lactation period, and we've got a much longer dry period where these cows are dry. And that's obviously an advantage because their nutrient requirements are much lower when they're dry as opposed to when they're lactating. So that's kind of the cow production system that I envisioned as an example for this alternative. And then the outer bar here, or the outer ring, is the grazing system. And in this one, not sure where to start, but we could start again here at the first of the year. We're going to have these cows grazing, out grazing on this native range all the way through the winter, all the way through the spring, and all the way through the early summer. So our calves are going to be born out on pasture at a nice time of the year, in a nice environment for a calf to be born. They're going to be out there grazing native range. And then as we get basically to the 1st of July, when we get to that critical point where we could have droughts, when we need to implement late season rest, we're going to come off of those pastures, completely destock the native range, and go into a dry lot, into confinement. And then we're going to manage those pairs the calves were born on pasture. Now they're pairs. We're going to take the pairs into the dry lot and manage them all the way through the fall, basically until we get to first frost. And we can wean those calves in the dry lot. We can and kind of manage that aspect of their weaning management like we talked about before. Manage all these cattle in a dry lot, and then as we get to first frost, when our native range goes dormant and is kind of protected from overgrazing, and we've passed that critical point and given it the rest that it needed in the late growing season, now it's dormant. Now we'll come out of the dry lot and go back and graze the native range when we're not going to cause a problem with too much grazing pressure. And so we've got this dry lot period here in the late summer and through the fall that I think is about 120 days. Okay, and it's interesting a little bit to me. You know, this dry lot period is about a third of the year, but a third to a half of this dry lot period we kind of had anyway in the traditional system. We were just feeding hay on native range. We were kind of spending the money like it was a dry lot or a confinement system. We just weren't reaping very many of the benefits that you could have of a dry lot system. And so part of the management and part of the effort and the expense of this dry lot system that you see here in the late summer and the fall is sort of offset by not feeding hay in the wintertime. And we can graze these cows on dormant native range with a protein supplement, do that very efficiently. We don't need these cows to gain much weight. They don't have to improve in body condition very much. We've got all this period in the dry lot from the end of lactation. We've got dry cows here for 90 days that we can do a tremendous amount of management on those cows to get them to the body condition that we want. And then all we need to do on native range is maintain that until we get over here. They're actually going to improve in body condition a little bit here in the spring before they calve again. So I think we can go through the winter system grazing these cows on dormant native range very efficiently and cost effectively with just a protein supplement, and shouldn't need much of one at that. So as reference for the breeding season, for this one would be July the 6th to August the 20th. So in Oklahoma, potentially that could be a problem with this kind of a system because of the heat. So that might be something to consider as a caveat to this system. And using those same assumptions that I had before, the nutrition cost of this kind of a system would be $414. So it'd be about $220 or $120 more expensive to provide the nutrition in this system than we were in the traditional system. So that's something to consider. You know, one way to think about that, I think in this ranch that I was thinking about, I was kind of had the concept of a stocking rate of about 12 acres per cow. So if that's $120 additional cost, you put that on 12 acres, that's $10 an acre. And the benefits to the native range pasture of a grazing system like this, I can envision might be worth more than $10 an acre. It may cost more than $10 an acre to do some other management to help this native range, whether that be clear cedar trees or control weeds and brush or those kind of things. So I think the nutrition cost will be higher, but it's potential in some situations you might get that back in improved management of the grazing resource. So here would be the alternative grazing plan. In this system, we've still got the 3 pastures. We're going to graze them in the spring up until the middle of the summer. Then we really are going to get a true rest, a true late season rest on the entire ranch, all the way through the late summer and fall. and then we're going to come back and graze those again November and December. I've actually put in this pasture. We could see how we could take one of these pastures, continue resting it through the fall, and not consume the fuel that we've accumulated there, burn it in the spring, and then incorporate prescribed burning into this management system as well. If you want to do that, you've now obviously increased the stocking density on some of the pastures, but you know in this system you've planned that you're going to rest those pastures next year. And so you can rotate through. Year 2, you would move that rest and move the burn to another pasture. Year 3 and 4, you can see how you can rotate the rest and the burn around the pastures and plan that into your management system. And potentially, the fact that you've had to increase stocking density a little bit on part of the native range at this time of the year could be offset because you've incorporated improved management in a plan, and you know that you're going to do that over time. So that's kind of an alternative grazing plan. So the stocking rate, as I just mentioned, the stocking rate on this system has a slightly lower stocking rate actually because we've got more days that we're in confinement. So in the long term, we've got a lower stocking rate. But as we talked about there, the stocking density is greater in some of these pastures. So in the traditional system, we had 12 acres per cow all year. In the alternative system, in the early spring, we've got that same 12 acres per cow. In the late summer, we have 0 acres per cow. And then in the fall through the winter, we've got 8 acres per cow. So we've changed the stocking density, but we haven't changed the stocking rate. And so one question is, how does that affect the native range ecosystem over time? And I'm not sure we know that exactly. I don't know that we know the answer to that question, but I think we could make some guesses for different situations. So quickly, just kind of wrap up, what are some of the opportunities and features of this system? For one thing, we talked about it, a system like this or a concept like this guarantees late season rest for the pasture. We've got a planned prescribed burn incorporated. We can do this kind of a system without much additional fencing. We don't need to do a lot of fencing, water development. You can take the pasture that you have and implement a system like this. You would need, you wouldn't need, it would take minimal fencing in the pastures. Now you would need quite a bit of facility development for the confinement system if you don't have that, obviously. You can incorporate rotational grazing into this system if you want to, but you don't have to. And then I think and we've talked about this has been mentioned several times too, having a feedlot facility provides a tremendous amount of flexibility. So you can take advantage of market prices of feedstuffs, you can feed older cows or heifers through the winter if you need to, you can grow and finish calves if you need to. There's all kinds of different things you could do with that facility if you had it that could improve income and really just give you a lot of flexibility in how you manage the grazing resource. And I think to think about it here, I think you could think, the investment in building the confinement facility would kind of be justified through the planned use of that facility in this grazing system. And then the flexibility that it gives you to do all these other things would be a bonus on top of that. And so I don't know that a lot of people would be real excited to build a confinement facility just on the off chance that they may want to do some of these things. But if you know you're going to use that facility through every year anyway, and then you get these flexibility things on top of it, I think that helps kind of justify it. Another feature that I like, calves are born and started on native grass pastures, so we don't have to deal with the calving problems that can sometimes be apparent in some confinement situations. So obviously there's lots of caveats. This system's not for everybody. The cows in dry lot can require a high level of management, but I think also having those cows in dry lot gives you an opportunity to apply technology to them that it would be hard to do if they were out grazing extensive pastures, such as AI and those kind of things. So this would be a question, that we talked about this a minute ago, what is a 50% increase in dormant season stocking density due to native range? And we could answer that question, but then if you say, if I know that I'm going to give it a late season rest every year and burn it every third year, what does that do? I don't know that we know the answer to that question totally. So that would be something to explore. Early weaning requires a high level of management as well. And then, something else that I think is interesting is the optimum cow type might be different in these two different kinds of systems. And so that would be something to think about as well. What kind of cows would you want if you were going to have one of these systems versus the other? And then, what the potential cost of this system might be. And so I think we've kind of gone through that, and I'm going to leave that there. But I think as we said before, good grazing management might be defined as providing an optimum set of these ecosystem services. And I think semi-confinement gives us a nice tool to be able to do a better job at that.